Well, good morning again, everyone. I'm Shauna Haley, your host for today's webinar. In this session, you'll learn how to rebuild trust, effectively communicate with stakeholders, and develop strategies to minimize the impact of a cyber attack. You'll leave this session with all the tools you need to safeguard your organization's reputation and restore confidence in your agency, or at least we hope you'll be well on the way. Our moderator today is Connie Odom, the Director of Communications and Media Relations for Williamson County. I'm going to let her introduce our panelists, but before I turn things over, I want to remind you to type your questions into the Q&A function. I'm going to monitor those for our panelists, and we'll try to answer them as we go and leave time at the end for more. As I mentioned earlier, we're recording this session and we'll post this to the TAMIO website in a few days. And keep those mouse pads and those fingers at the ready. We're going to have some poll questions in today's session. All right, Connie, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Shanna. And want to thank TAMIO too for sponsoring this webinar. I'm really excited to be talking about this topic. I've been a county communicator for 19 years, and I've been preparing for all kinds of emergencies, flooding and ice storms and tornadoes. But this one is one that is becoming much more prevalent and is occurring much more often for government communicators, and that's cyber attacks. So as communication professionals, we need to be ready for any emergency event that happens. And so we have three great panelists today with us that are going to give us insight into what we need to do to prepare in advance. And then also what are maybe some constraints that we need to consider in how we communicate with the public about cyber attacks. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists, and remember to use that Q&A function when you come up with questions that you want to ask them. First, we have Ernesto Ballesteros. He is the Cybersecurity State Coordinator for the state of Texas. He works for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. And his role is to build strategic public and private sector relationships in Texas to facilitate the development and maintenance of secure and resilient infrastructure. So welcome, Ernesto. Next, we have Richard Semple. He is the Chief Information Officer here at Williamson County, and his job is to manage the countywide information systems and services that keep county operations running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year long. He shepherded the county's technology services department during COVID, when everybody was suddenly sent home to work remotely, and when our court systems had to learn how to operate remotely as well. He was also at the helm when we had cyber criminals who tried to hack into the county's computer system. So welcome, Richard. And finally, we have Kelly Lewis, who is the marketing director at the city of Carrollton. Kelly is a seasoned communication professional. She's worked 16 years for the city of Carrollton, which is home to about 135,000 residents. And she remembers back a few years, about 2019, when nearly 24 Texas cities were all hacked with ransomware. And since then, cyber attacks have occurred at a number of cities. It's a question of not if your organization will be attacked, but when it's going to happen. So I thought to start our panelists out and learn a little bit about our audience, we have a couple polling questions that we want to ask you. So first, does your organization have a cyber attack crisis plan? So here's the poll. Go ahead and respond to that. We'll give you a minute to respond. Does your organization have a cyber attack crisis plan? So have you been thinking about this? Are you ready for it? Let's see how prepared our audience is in advance with that. So while we're finishing up with that poll question, why don't we go ahead and go to our first question, which is, what should communications professionals be doing now to prepare? One thing, of course, is probably having this crisis plan that we're talking about, but let's go ahead and start with Ernesto. And if you could tell us, based on your discussion, so, okay, here's the poll outcome is the majority said no. I just saw that on there, flash up on the screen. So we've got a lot of work to do to help them today. So Ernesto, you encourage agencies to include legal counsel in their discussions. And so what do you think people should do to prepare for an attack? And then also let us know what resources CISA has, if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the outset, folks, I want to thank our hosts here for giving us an opportunity to really, bring awareness to what I think is an incredibly important topic. It's important enough to where, U.S. Congress stood up, an agency that really focuses on these issues. To answer your question directly, though, Connie, I would say, first, organizations really should have some sort of a cybersecurity incident response plan. And in that plan, there really should be a communications plan. And, this plan would really put an organization in a position to where they can minimize the amount of downtime when an incident does occur, and hopefully get back to a pre-incident state such that they can, really just get back to serving their people. I imagine we're talking, most folks here in the audience are going to be civil servants or public servants. And so we're talking about plans that would help us continue to deliver critical services that citizens rely on during a time of crisis. Now, you mentioned making sure that you're, working with general counsel, when you're writing this plan, and especially during a crisis. And the reason behind that is that, oftentimes we're not quite sure what we're supposed to communicate, to whom we're supposed to communicate that with. And likewise, what methods in order to communicate certain types of information that would be associated with something like a ransomware attack, where potentially you may have customer or you could have CJIS or any kind of maybe health information, any kind of personally identifiable information that would be subject to some sort of a federal, state, or maybe even some sort of a municipal code. And you really want to work with counsel before this ever happens, so that at the very least what your legal or regulatory requirements are in terms of providing notice, either to your regulatory bodies or maybe even to your partners or your insurance providers. And so there's what you have to do legally, and then there's, of course, ways that you can massage that information such that you preserve what trust you have built already with your customers, with the people you serve.
Great, thank you so much. Piggybacking on that, why don't we go ahead and ask Richard, from an IT standpoint, what are some preventative measures that government communicators need to look at doing, either as the organization or, for us individually?
Sure. Well, thanks. I think the biggest thing across all agencies is education, right? Our users are always the weakest link. There are folks that are going to fall for the phishing emails, that are going to pick up the phone and provide credentials to somebody that sounds legitimate. And so the best thing we as IT folks can do, and everybody in government can do, is educate themselves on what type of attacks are out there, what some of the things that cyber criminals are doing to try to exploit weaknesses. And, a lot of that, unfortunately, plays off of people's best instincts, right? Is to be kind, to help people. A lot of us are in government in order to help people, right? And some people, hey, I really need your help with this document. Can you please open this? Or even call now. I think one of the scarier things out there for folks should be the rise of use of artificial intelligence to drive some scams and some attempts to gain credentials, because it could sound like an elected official asking for information. And so really educating ourselves on what's out there, right, is huge. And if let's say you get someone who calls you that sounds like a county judge, right? The message is a little weird. Maybe it's that your organization has a thing that says, you know what, Judge, I'm going to hang up and I'm going to call you back on your phone. And then pick up the phone and find out maybe it wasn't him. So that education about what the current environment and threats are is really important. As IT professionals, we generally keep good inventory of software and services, but it's also really important that that's each department and, say, communication professionals know what's out there too, right? If you've got social media accounts, you've got things, they're there, those are great to keep good inventories of, to ensure they're protected with what they call multi-factor authentication, right? Whether it's a text code or an authenticator app, is really great. And ensure your IT department knows about those sites too, because if IT doesn't know about them, they can't help you secure them. And so, if all of a sudden the county, Twitter account is blasting out Bitcoin links, if IT doesn't know about it, they can't help monitor and secure it as well. And then, I think making sure that data is backed up and that there's a plan for getting to it if you're unable to access it, right? I know a lot of that's back in the IT department, sure, but each department needs to have a plan for what they're going to do in partnership with IT to say, if we don't have access to, OneDrive, what do we do? If we don't have access to this server, these systems, how do we communicate? And I think it's really on the departments to try to figure that out with IT's help.
Sorry, unmuting myself. I was just looking at the CISA ransomware guide that you put in the chat. So that's a great resource. And thank you, Richard, for those great suggestions. I know that I was fooled once by one of your phishing emails. So I do know that the educational component helps quite a bit, teaching us all what to be careful of and what not to click on, and don't trust something just because it's from your elected official. So thank you for that.
And sorry not to interrupt you, but I like to say, as part of that education, one thing we do is send out those fake phishing emails, right, to try to trip people up, with the goal of showing what you did wrong and what you should look for next time. And progressively educating folks who keep clicking on those and saying, okay, now we really need to focus on you because every time you failed our phishing test. Those things help, but the goal isn't to punish anyone. The goal is to try to get them to a better point of education.
Very good. Thank you. Let's go ahead and take another quick polling question before we go to Kelly. Has your organization conducted a cyber attack exercise or tabletop? And that's something that I know Ernesto had mentioned earlier that CISA can do is help your organization with doing a tabletop exercise for a cyber attack. But has your organization practiced your plan? So for those of you who have a plan, have you put that to use through an exercise or tabletop exercise so that you can run through those steps and know what you're going to do? Let's see how prepared our audience is in relation to this question. And no, so 72% have not done an exercise yet. So I think that's, it's good to know where our audience is and how we can help them in this area. And so Kelly, why don't we go to you now and talk about what advice do you have for folks in the communications field to prepare in advance for something like a cyber attack?
Sure. I'll echo a little bit of what Richard just said about making sure that you're working with IT in advance. That business continuity plan that he was talking about is really key for all departments, making sure that all departments know what software they use, what are you going to need access to that might be down if you are hit by an attack. For example, when we had one that we didn't have access to our website, we weren't cloud-based at the time. So working with IT since then to move to cloud has been integral, but at the time we didn't have that. So we had to find the information that we could to get information out to the public. So what were our channels that were still available and how could we access those without access to computers and everything that went down, phone lines? We didn't have any of that to share with the public. So those tabletop exercises would be very helpful for departments, I think, to see what do you need, things that you wouldn't think about even when you're just sitting down and writing your plan. If you actually act it out, oh no, our phones are down. So what do we do? How do we go through this plan? And write all of that down and include it in your plan. Another piece that I think was very helpful for us, and you can do this well in advance of a potential attack, is finding out from your leadership what their direction would be. Are they interested in paying if it's a ransom attack and that's the direction? Are they never going to pay? So that you can start building your plan based off of that information. And then maintaining hard copies of information is very important. I know that can be a challenge in the world that we're in a digital age, but if you can have, not just your continuity plan, but copies of pertinent information available, or maybe an extra hard drive with a logo, for example. When we had issues, we lost everything for a while, including our city logo. So we had to actually reach out to partners to get some of our own information back, which is a horrible situation to be in. Obviously we had different things available, but most of it was digital, and you can't have a printed out copy of your logo. That's not useful. So finding a way to have that in your plan, maybe a hard drive or some sort of system of backup, depending on how bad the attack is that hits you.
Great advice with that. Thank you. That was great advice on that one. So our next question for the audience, kind of going into that, for our audience members, do you know the software platforms that you use? Do you have a list maybe of all of those software platforms? If you had to reestablish everything because you have lost it, then what software platforms would you need to reestablish? Let's take a look and see what our audience has to say about that. I know that it's commonplace. We know, we just open up our laptops and we know exactly everything's there. And so what happens if you can't do that? And you have to reestablish those accounts? Do you know, what are all the software platforms that you use? And so, yes, good. Our audience members are very well versed in all the software that they use. So make sure that you've got that written down somewhere and you've got that information ready to reinstall that. So let's go into, what happens in the event of a cyber attack, because there are some restrictions on what you can and can't say. So Richard, why don't we go to you first this time? In the case of the county attack, one thing that happened was you were encouraged to tell your counterparts at municipalities, at counties, a little bit of what to expect or what was going on. So what did you say, and what did you not say? And then where is that line for keeping the public informed without letting people know your vulnerabilities? So Richard?
Yeah, that's a good, excellent question. And I'll just talk just for a second about what we experienced last May. We had an incident where someone had used a co-opted account and had been monitoring for some time, and then installed some malicious software that was able to capture more privileged credentials, and then basically tried to run an attack against a lot of our servers. And for us, it was a middle of the night thing. And fortunately, we've got some folks that work 24/7 in departments. Unfortunately, some of those are like 911 and the jail and some other places. And so, but because those folks were affected, they saw some suspicious things and called it in. Our folks were able to respond. And then that does trigger the interesting question of what do you tell and to whom, right? We had a good plan of who to call for help, but we knew at some point we'd need to share that information out, potentially with the public and potentially with other governments that we partner with, the cities that are in the county, the other agencies we connect to at the state and other agencies. And so we had a lot of internal debate, of course, while we're trying to figure out what's going on, also about what we tell and to whom. And one of the folks we were working with was our local FBI cyber crimes rep, along with CISA and DIR. And our local FBI rep said, you know, you really have to share this information out with your cities. You really have to get this information out. And part of the challenge we face, and I think everyone's going to face during a cyber attack, is, well, what's happening, right? What software do we tell people to look out for? Or just do we say, oh gosh, look out for a cyber attack? Well, hopefully they're already looking out for that. And so, you know, we really wanted some actionable information. We wanted to figure out enough that we could say, hey, look for this piece of software, look for these kind of suspicious user accounts, look for this, and then distribute that out to those agencies that would potentially be affected as well. But for sharing with the public, you know, of course, Connie and I had talked, and you know, one of the thoughts was that if it affects the delivery of services to the public, that's really when we need to start talking publicly very soon about it. You know, then get ahead of that messaging to the citizens that hey, this service is unavailable, we're working on the issue, and that sort of thing. You know, it's way later that we're going to find out, you know, what's potentially compromised or breached or accessed by a third party. That could take months, potentially. But you know, there was certain information we didn't communicate to the public during that incident because there wasn't the delivery of services to the public that was affected, right? The website didn't go down, 911 didn't go down. There were some things internally that had to be worked on and rebuilt, but you know, there's no reason to tell the public, oh my gosh, we're undergoing a cyber attack, if there's nothing the public can do about it, and no action needed on someone's part. And so those are hard lines to draw, especially when things are changing rapidly, right? You know, when you find someone accessing systems they shouldn't, you have to dig in and find out what exactly they had access to, potentially exfiltrated, or potentially corrupted, you know, but again, that could take a long time. And so when we communicated this out first to, you know, some employees in IT, and then department heads around, and then of course, CISA, the FBI, and DIR, you know, we really talked about information that was need to know, right? And of course, CISA and FBI and DIR and those partners, here's everything. Here's access to everything, and here's everything. Help us. But for even department heads, you know, we said, hey, you know, we've got some unauthorized access and a breach, and we're going to have to rebuild some servers as preventative measures. In our case, we were very lucky; we didn't have to lose anything permanently. We had some excellent backups, and the timing was really good, that we were able to recover very quickly. And by the time most people showed up for work on Monday, they had no idea. And so for the public, we never did make a big announcement about it, because we had it handled so quickly, and we were able to determine that no data was exfiltrated to partners, you know, to folks that shouldn't have had access. And so that was a huge boon. But really, you know, if you don't have something useful for folks, you know, you have to think about why you might communicate that, what they can do with it.
Great. Thank you for that, Richard. So Kelly, how about you? So what do you say, maybe when you don't have something yet you can say, or, you know, there are things you're being told you can't say. So any thoughts on that? And then also best practices to repair your organization's reputation after something like this has happened, and restoring their confidence.
Sure. Yeah, we were also fortunate to catch what was happening in our city very quickly. Unfortunately, it still took a lot down. So we definitely had to tell the public something, because it was pretty obvious that our phone lines were down, our website was down. And it can be very challenging at a time when you're trying to figure out with all of those partner agencies and your own team, what is happening, what is compromised, to tell the public the information. Especially when there are different viewpoints on how much you should share. And then once people do find out, obviously you start getting the calls from reporters, and it can combust pretty quickly if you don't have a good plan there. We were able to put out information quickly that we had experienced a criminal attack, and that we were, working the plan and getting working with all of the different partner agencies to see what was compromised. So a very basic statement to start everything off, and to let people know where to go to find information, since we did lose our website and we had to come up and work on a plan for basically a takeover of a splash screen to say where to go in the meantime. We also lost all of our email accounts, so we had to build Gmail accounts temporarily until we could get everything back up and running. So ours was a little bit more dire in terms of, if you need something, here's how you can get in touch with us. We got very lucky in that we purchased several laptops for a couple different departments that were going to be using some Surfaces for field work basically, and had not touched them in terms of opening, or they were not part of our network yet. So we had those ready to deploy immediately. And then other than that, we went out and purchased a lot of phones and started handing them out and having new phone numbers for people, and really rebuilt things very quickly. A lot of EOC work there for our team, our entire management team, to get together and figure out who was essential to need laptops at that time, who was going to need a phone number immediately, like what, rebuild our lists. All non-essential people were called in to help retype important documents or recover them in whatever way that they could, while our IT department and those partner agencies were seeing what was salvageable from our servers. Ultimately, we were able to recover a lot of our information, but there was that time period where it was down, and telling people that information was challenging, because we don't have as much to say as what people want to hear. We don't have the information, for one thing, and a lot of it is a criminal investigation. So some of it you can just explain that away as I truly don't know some of those answers still. That was October of 2019 for us. And some of those things I still don't know the answers to, because I wasn't privy to that, and I don't need to know that. I can just tell you, the public, that once we found this out, of course, that their information was not compromised, which was a huge win for us. Obviously, it's a different story if that was the case. And then I think you have to mitigate that, the reaction of that however you can. Luckily, we were fortunate to not have that. So we could focus more on building things up and telling people where to find information. And it's a long process too. It's not just the initial one. It's as time goes, it's, were they able to access paying their water bill? In our case, the answer was no. So it's communicating out that you won't be turned off. Your water won't be turned off. You won't receive late fees. So working with your management to make sure that y'all are on the same page with that information, and then communicating that out with whatever channels you do have access to as those others are being built up. And then you had a second part of your question, Connie, and I've already forgotten what it was.
Oh, just about your organization's reputation. How do you, work then to kind of restore the public's confidence in
Right.
the city and the city processes?
I feel like thankfully we didn't have to restore anything for ours. I'm sure that's not the case for everyone. And again, that goes back to probably that our information wasn't compromised. And part of that is luck. And part of that was that we had trained employees that were there, similar to what Richard said. They saw some fishy things happening, and no pun intended on the fishing. And they were able to literally unplug things as weird happenings were, occurring. So better to shut it down and stop things just in case. So we were fortunate, but also had done all of the trainings, thankfully, that everyone's doing. I would say that it's really important to overdo those trainings. And back to, again, we mentioned earlier, the phishing emails and making sure that people are trained. Don't just do the bare minimum of that. And then as far as the public knows, we communicate that to the public that we do all of those trainings. We do significantly more than the state requirements for trainings. We did prior to this. That's not always enough. And I think some of it was in our wording. We made sure to, with our legal counsel's assistance, explain that we're victims here, that this is a criminal action, and we are working with our partner agencies to do what we can to bring them to justice on this. It's a horrible crime that's taking place or attempting to take place, and it's happening all over. So we can all be part of the solution in terms of paying attention, doing those trainings, making sure that you are cautious. And I'll tell you that everyone in our organization that went through that, they're not plugging things into their computer. They're not clicking on any links. That was way too frustrating and terrifying of a process. But we have new employees that didn't go through that. So it's just an old story to them that the people who've been here longer tell. So you have to keep up that culture, and you have to keep up that training, and a little bit of a scare tactic to them as well, to make sure that they are doing everything they can to maintain that, because that's part of keeping the public's trust, is to show that we're doing what we can. Some of it is out of our control. I mean, we put all the resources to it. Criminals have more resources, but we can do the best that we can, and just constant vigilance.
That's a great point. It's not just doing your exercises and doing your planning, but letting the public know that you're actively doing that, so that they have confidence that you're able to handle things. And then like you said, you were a victim, so you can't really control everything in that. To do another quick question for our audience, Kelly, you had mentioned before having paper copies of things. And so I want to know how many folks out there have paper copies of your media list. Do you have a paper copy? Do you keep a paper copy of your media list? Can you get in touch with your media if you suddenly don't have that electronic list that you can just throw into Outlook to send something out, or that you don't have on a other type of system? So let's see how ready people are with their paper copy. Okay, it's 50-50 there. 50-50 on having the paper copy. Good to know. Good to know. So Ernesto, let's go to you on this one. What about, advice that you have on what you can say, and also about maybe what you should tell employees about what they can say or can't say?
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, I've got to kind of put my lawyer's hat on here, and I think that you absolutely must speak with general counsel before these events ever happen. These incidents really are much more than just an event. These are disruptive. In a lot of cases, there are going to be absolute legal requirements for things that you must communicate. You must provide notice, and you must do so within the time that's specified under whatever regulation or statute may be a covered entity. So at the very least, you want to cover your bases there. And I would always encourage folks, whether you're in IT or public information, whoever really you have part of this cyber incident response and recovery effort, make good friends with counsel. You really want them to zealously represent you and make you fully informed on who you need to communicate with, how that you need to communicate with them. And so at least you cover the bare minimums in terms of regulatory compliance. Now, the second part of that question was talking to the users and making sure that they are very well trained, how to deal with information that they will be privy to during an incident. You certainly wouldn't want users in your operating environment to not know, number one, who to contact. God forbid if an incident does occur. Back when I worked for the Texas Department of Information Resources, we mentioned House Bill 3834 earlier, maybe not by the name of the bill, but the state certified training. And when I was developing those standards, I was very, very careful to make sure that folks are going to understand who they contact, when they contact, and then also you should have some training that educates folks on how to handle that information. You don't want folks pulling out their cell phone and taking a picture of a ransom note on their screen at work and sending it off to the local news networks. That could be catastrophic. It could really, in a lot of cases, maybe even hurt investigations, but also, maybe your strategy on how to respond and recover. And that kind of kills a lot of your options there. But we really want folks to understand exactly when they see this information, or rather when they identify an incident or they're made aware of an incident, that information has to stay within the organization, because you really have to be all singing on the same shade of music and having a unified message on what's going to exit, what you're going to communicate to the public.
Very important, yes, to be all on the same page and doing the training. You might mention that training again. I'm sure they get that information from their technology services department, but the state training that you mentioned.
Yeah, so that came out of House Bill 3834, probably about 2 legislative sessions ago, 2019. And that's your state certified cybersecurity training programs that you can find on the Texas Department of Information Resources website. And I'm sure if you all are local governments in the state of Texas, you probably are already comfortably aware of that requirement there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. And then let's do a final question for our audience. This is something that I'm sure many of us are guilty of, but do you share any logins with your team members? So if you have maybe a social media account or something where there's just one login and you share it among the team, are there any other types of logins that you have that you might share among your team members instead of having individual logins for some of those programs? So let's see what our audience has to say about having shared logins. Yes, we do. We do that quite a bit. So with that, why don't we go ahead and go with some final words of advice from our panelists to share with all the folks that are listening right now. What are your final words of wisdom? And this time, Kelly, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think it's going to be to reiterate that it's important to make that plan, have that continuity plan. Don't just leave it up to your IT department, because from a communication standpoint, you need to make sure that you have all of your ducks in a row for your own department needs to be able to communicate what's happening, and then to not let that plan get dusty. Don't just put it on the shelf. Check it. I mean, like I said before, the criminals have a lot of resources, so they're constantly using new technology, and like AI is ever evolving there. We need to always be updating that plan. It doesn't do any good if you just write one and then never do any exercises with it or never think about it. Getting the buy-in from the employees, I think, is really important too. Back to what I said before about that culture, you're going to have turnover, so make sure that you're always prioritizing training people to mitigate that risk, because that's your first step, is making sure that you've done all that you can do to prevent something from happening, and then that you're prepared if something does happen, because something's always going to happen. So basically just preparing there. And then some of the things are out of your control, but if you can work with your leadership to do the most in advance of utilizing cloud-based services where you can, or diversifying in a way that not everything would go down if something was hacked, for example, and just having all of those boxes checked for having plans available, hard copies available, digital version, and back to that diversifying.
Very good. Thank you for those words of wisdom, Kelly. Ernesto, what about you? What are your final words for our audience here before we get to questions?
You know, Kelly said it very well, but I'm going to go ahead and foot stomp and echo here. You know, at CISA, we really recommend at all times, but especially over the last year or so through our Shields Up campaign, that if you folks don't already have an understanding of what your current operating environment looks like in terms of cybersecurity, we encourage you, number one, to reach out to your region and get to know your cybersecurity advisor. They can come out there, they can perform some cybersecurity assessments, give you a good idea of where you stand right now, based against some very well-known cybersecurity frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity framework. And then, importantly for this particular topic, if you have a plan, that plan you should probably exercise. We can help you exercise that plan. I do tabletop exercises all the time for both large and small organizations. That is important for any organization, regardless of your sector, your size, as well as your sophistication. If you do not have a plan, that is fine. We can start to help you get to develop a plan. There are a number of resources that we have. In fact, kind of put some there in the chat. If you don't have a plan, we can do a workshop to help you build one. But I would encourage you to look at our ransomware guide that was just recently updated this year. That is a fantastic guide that will take you through cradle to grave on what you should do to get prepared, creating an inventory of all of your vital assets, backing them up, having redundant hardware, getting everybody in a group to figure out who's going to be responsible for how to respond, as well as how to recover from an incident. And then also kind of doing some good housekeeping and starting to address all of the major vectors of attack, looking at your users, training your users, doing phishing campaigns to assess whether or not the training is even effective. Likewise, in addition to that, starting to look at the major thresholds of your home, right? Doing vulnerability assessments on your internet-facing devices, and then also starting to do vulnerability assessments on those devices that live inside your network. Those are the devices that are going to be exploited. And then, God forbid, if an incident does occur, having a plan, at least a very basic plan on, number one, identifying who's responsible to go out there, identify what assets have been compromised, quarantining those assets from the rest of the network, and then going through the process of eradicating and then figuring out how we're going to come back up to a pre-incident response. All the while this is occurring, folks, you're going to work with all personnel across your organization, council. You're going to work with your public information officers, and this is a team sport. Last thing I want to say, if you have a plan and you're exercising, you really need to go through a post-mortem or an after-action review. When it is done, and I mean soon thereafter the incident has occurred, you need to know what went well, what didn't go so well. By the way, who's responsible for fixing the issues that didn't go so well according to the plan, and then going out there and actually fixing those issues. I'll get off my soapbox there.
Great words of advice. So thank you so much for that, Ernesto. And then Richard, what do you have to tell our communicators for your last bit of advice before we go to questions?
Well, I think there's a huge responsibility for the IT department in a lot of this, but I think it's a big responsibility for every group in government to ensure they're partnering with the IT folks to ensure that IT knows about a lot of things, right? If IT can't see it, can't help you secure it. And so that's a big thing. And it's really a matter of when this happens. It's not if, right? Everyone's going to get hit by this, and we have to be right every single time, and the bad guys only have to be right once to get through. Right? That's not very fair odds, but it's where we are. And it's kind of funny, as we were talking here, I got a text message and I looked, and it's a scam trying to capture my credentials, right? It's supposed to be from the post office, and here's a link, and go ahead and log in and you can get your package delivered. And so, these things are taking all kinds of forms all the time. And so, keeping up that vigilance and having responsibility down to each user to know what to do is super important.
Very good. Thank you so much for that. And I want to thank all of our panelists for all your good advice. Shannon, do we have any questions in the chat?
Rookie error there, forgot to take myself off mute. No one has dropped a question in the chat yet, but we are open to any questions that our attendees may have. I'll start with one question, and some of these things we talked about as we were pre-gaming. It's almost like conflicting advice. You shouldn't print and have passwords sitting on your desk, yet at the same time you need to have access to passwords in case your systems go down. So what's an easy way to solve for that?
If I can jump in with one, and I'm not sure this is a textbook solution, but it's an interesting one we came up with, was we do have some what we call break glass accounts. And we actually, for quite a long time, had those sealed in envelopes and had those actually entered into the sheriff's office evidence as evidence, because it's the most secure place we could think of. And, we had a very small list of who can go in there and request, to get that envelope out of evidence and go get that if we absolutely needed to. it's a little bit of a pain to update and keep like that. But it is kind of an interesting solution to how to keep those in a very secure way.
Good. Any other questions from our audience? This was a pretty comprehensive review. I'm sure everybody's heads are exploding on all the things they need to do. Feel free to drop it in the Q&A or in the chat.
You know,
There is
Shannon,
a lot to think about, like you mentioned. Oh, go ahead, Ernesto, go ahead.
wanted to say, number one, Richard's solution is, I think that's a cool solution. Very creative. You know, if you ever have to go back to kind of like, you know, analog solution, that's a good way to do it. And he's absolutely right. The big issue here is always going to be about, you know, controlling the keys, who's going to have access to the keys, and having, you know, accountability and, you know, kind of almost like a chain of custody, I guess is what the terminology would use when you're putting things into evidence. You know, one other solution that I think that maybe folks should think about too, it's always kind of buyer beware, and you got to do your due diligence and, you know, assess the risk, but are, you know, password management solutions, whether they be in the cloud, you know, or live locally in your network. You know, they certainly, you want to kind of go and do your homework again and figure out just whether or not they're vulnerable to any types of known attacks. But that's another thing that you might want to look into, a password vault of some sort.
Good advice. That's really good advice. Any others? I don't see any other questions right now. Probably think people will think of it as they go through creating their plan that we've talked about and then exercising their plan. They're going to be coming up with things. I know continuity of operations is something we talk about a lot. And in my head, I just keep thinking about, okay, a tornado's hit my building and I just can't get into my building or something of that nature. But thinking about the fact that I might not be able to answer my phone, I might not be able to get into any of my tools that I have online. Those are scary thoughts. And that's something that everybody should be planning for now, for, as we've said, for when that happens to your organization, and keeping all employees on the ready for something like that. So.
Absolutely. And I'll just wrap by saying that, you know, Plano's gone through a cybersecurity continuity plan, and it's amazing the amount of things that you have to think about. So it's a great conversation to start with your IT folks, with your city management folks, if you have an emergency management point of contact, because it does take a lot of time. But I think hearing from others' experiences, we know it's the simple things like put your logo on a thumb drive so that you have it if you need to, keep your passwords secure and stop sharing them. Makes a big difference. So thank you to all of our panelists. This has been a really thought-provoking session. I think the big takeaway from this is it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. And our organizations are under cyber attack all the time. And hopefully most of the time we are unaware of it because our organizations are taking care of it. The recording of this session will be posted to the TAMIO website in the next day or two. I do have a couple of announcements for everyone before we wrap up. First of all, this Friday, we are hosting our first ever Facebook Live session with our TAMIO teammates. We have a great group of folks who are teammates with various areas of expertise that are available to help us. And so we've asked them to take a leading role in providing some education throughout the year. The first one is this Friday. Francis LaRue is hosting a session focused on Instagram tips and tricks. So that'll be a great session over in our private Facebook group. Secondly, I want you to go ahead and mark your calendars now for next month's webinar, August 8th. We are going to have a special presentation of the Edelman Trust Barometer. And if you aren't familiar with the Edelman Trust Barometer, you will be at the end of the webinar, and it's one you don't want to miss. So thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you very much to Connie for putting this session together and for moderating such a good discussion. We appreciate all of you, and we hope you have a good day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.